let's focus on the positive and focus on supersexuality and what constitutes supersexuality, practically speaking. So when we talk about the law of sex, we bring it back to this fundamental underlying truism that we're talking about the feminine aspect of the Christ. We're talking about the Divine Mother, and that how we use and or abuse her determines whether that energy flows up and Adam or down and out, determines whether we make of our own individual Divine Mother, whether we make of her a virgin or a whore, i.e. the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ, or the whore of Babylon. That's what these symbols represent. The whore of Babylon was not an actual woman. And the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ, is, yes, she gave birth to Jesus, but she's also a symbol. She's the symbol of the transmuted divine feminine force, the transmuted risen Kundalini, which gives rise to the Christ within all of us. So if infrasexuality has another name called Black Tantra, supersexuality is, of course, White Tantra. This is also known as sexual alchemy because of the fact that we are talking about the transmutation of the sexual force. And the prominent allegory in alchemy, in sexual alchemy, is to transmute the lead of ego into the gold of the human soul. That's alchemy. And this was done via the mythological philosophical stone, the seven-sided philosophical stone, or the keystone, the cornerstone. That stone is an allegory for sex, but for supersexuality, a pyramid on top of a cube. That's why in Egypt, you have all those obelisks, a none too subtle symbol, a very phallic philosophical stone. So then, practically speaking, what are we talking about here? We said that the Kundalini is essentially the Christ, but it's contained in nature, but it's the feminine aspect. So this is the feminine aspect. The masculine aspect is in the crown chakra. In Christian terms, it's known as the Holy Spirit. All right, so this is the masculine aspect. When we engage in supra-sexuality, in White Tantra, in sexual alchemy, and we awaken the Kundalini during coitus, and we work with the various practices that we are going to discuss. We're going to share those with you. The feminine, the fires of Kundalini rise up the spinal column and unite in the crown chakra with the masculine aspect, with the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the Kundalini's husband. This is the divine masculine. The Kundalini is divine feminine. Yeah, we should have written it like this, divine feminine. And here we have the divine masculine. Now, the Holy Spirit is also a fire. We'll touch on the fires and the waters and so on, because sexuality is also associated with the waters. So we have the sexual waters, but within those sexual waters is the fire. And it's the fire of Kundalini that rises up the spinal column. It's that fire that's being extracted from the waters, the creative waters. When the fire of the divine feminine rises up and unites with the fire of the divine masculine, the result gives rise to the fire of fires and the light of lights. In other words, the Christ, which is the divine androgen. Fires of divine feminine unite with fires of the divine masculine, and in that union, those two fires come together to give rise to the fire of fires and light of lights of the divine androgen, the Christ. This is metaphysical science now. This is just like electricity, positive and negative and neutral. This is just like in the atom. This is just like pollinating a flower, right? This is just like making a baby with a sperm entering into the ovum. And the result is the zygote. You have a feminine and you have a masculine coming together. And for a brief period of time, all zygotes, all embryos for a brief period of time are androgynous. They even have a tail until through subsequent processes of cell division and complication and so on and so forth, the sex is determined and the unfolding of the embryo into a fetus. But for a brief period of time, they're androgynous. The Christ is always androgynous. It's the Christic force. It's the force that divides into the Holy Spirit and the Divine Mother, the Divine Masculine and Divine Feminine. And the Divine Feminine unfolds the physical universe on all its levels, all manifested reality. So when we talk about supra-sexuality, we are reversing the process of metaphysical creation, of divine creation. We're reversing that process. We're withdrawing from mechanical nature back up into our divine nature to give rise, to give birth to our potential as divine beings. That's why the Christ child is born in the manger amongst our animal egos, because we're not perfect. We still have a lot of ego. But if we practice White Tantra, sexual alchemy, we slowly begin to give rise to the vehicles, the vessels, which can allow us to embody the cosmic Christ. So right now, we are said to have lunar bodies. But in order to give rise to the Christ, in order to become a living embodiment of the Logos, we have to have solar bodies. Our lunar bodies are riddled with egos, which makes them mechanical. This is the lead that we're working with, right? Our egos and our lunar bodies, mechanical bodies, reactive, mechanical, habitual, conditioned selves, this ego personality that we identify as, this mortal vessel. The solar bodies are conscious. If egos are what make us mechanical and what we need are solar bodies, but the Kundalini, the sexual force right now is bottled up inside of lust, inside of anger, pride, fear, etc. These are our egos. There has to be a process by which we eliminate these, because all of this is causing the Kundalini to flow down and out through suffering. That's our tale of Satan, by the way. Shaitan, the adversary. If you set yourself to practicing White Tantra, sexual alchemy, and you do not do your shadow work, as we described in the, not last week, but in the previous 3 weeks, the AUM of Life, follow your bliss, explore your abyss, and return to base. But doing your shadow work, eliminating the egos and extracting the wisdom, the knowledge inside, that consciousness that you're extracting is part of the material that's being used to create conscious solar bodies. But moreover, the sexual energy that was being wasted, that was flowing down and out, is now freed to flow up and at them. But if you don't do your so-called shadow work, if you don't work with the AUM of Life, if you don't work on the comprehension and elimination of your egos, and you just try to transmute the sexual energy, but you don't work on eliminating egos, you end up with what we've talked about in the past. You end up as a Hasna Musan, someone with a dual center of gravity, someone who's developing their solar bodies, but because a lot of their consciousness and sexual energy is still bottled up inside of their egos, they're also developing their lunar bodies. They're creating more egos and the dual center of gravity. This is called a Hasna Musan, but in mythology, they're depicted as centaurs, half men, half goats. Their upper body is a man, but their lower body is a goat. And in mythology, in ancient times, goats were a depiction of sexual promiscuity, animal sexuality, in other words, because goats will eat anything and goats will, they have sex like rabbits, which is why serendipitously, we're only really getting into this topic now after what we've discussed in previous weeks. Because for anyone to practice Tantra and not be doing the psychological work, they're essentially turning themselves into a demon, especially if they continue with infrasexuality.